Teachers, thank you for tuning in as we talk about this session 8 as it's on the Sanctity of Life Sunday. And I thought I'd just share with you some things that I did in terms of the lesson and pointing some things out. The way I started the lesson was I showed them a $5 bill. This is a $10 bill, and asked them how much this was, what the value of this was, and of course they knew. And then I asked, what is it that gives it its value? And they had different answers about what gave it $10 worth and so forth. And then I just crumpled it up and asked them, after I crumpled it up, how valuable is it now? Well, of course it's worth $10. And I said, well, if I were to spill my coffee on it, would I throw it away like a napkin, or would I keep it? And they said, well, you just wash it off and keep using it. And then I asked who had the birthday nearest to this day, and then I gave them that $5 as a birthday present. But my point that I was driving at is it's what's outside of this that determines the value of it. And in light of that, we're going to be talking about the value of human beings, and it's God that gives us our value. Now, the summary statement of the lesson says God created humanity in His image, giving human life sacred value. And again, I like to take time to walk through that statement with them to help them understand this is what the lesson is about. For example, just take the first two words, God created. Right there, it immediately creates this division in our society, because for the most part, most people probably believe that there is some evolutionary element in terms of human beings. And so either man is created or he has evolved. Now notice that it says God created humanity, and He's the only one who created humanity. That's the Christian view in terms of how we understand it. But notice it says God created humanity in His image. And the idea of image is His picture, what is God-like. And this is the first calling of human beings. We are to be God-like human beings. And if we repeated that to ourselves as we encountered people, it'd have a powerful impact upon our way of relating to people. God created humanity in His image, giving human life sacred value. Now, not just value. Notice the summary statement says it's sacred value, because every ideology gives value to human beings. Communism gives human beings an economic value. I suppose capitalism gives human beings a labor value. But it is the Christian faith that gives sacred value to human beings. The word sacred means respect or reverence. And so because we are created by God in His image, He has given us an esteem, a value that is sacred. It's to be reverenced. It's to be respected. And so from talking about the introduction to talking about this summary statement, then we move into the lesson. And I explained that this is the Sanctity of Life Sunday and the history behind that. The Roe versus Wade decision was on January 22nd, 1973. And then in 1984, President Ronald Reagan designated January 22nd as the Sanctity of Life Day. And churches all across the nation on the third Sunday in January celebrate Sanctity of Life Sunday. And that's why our lesson takes this pause in the study of Genesis to talk about the sanctity of life. Our passage begins with Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And I asked them, as we read this, what if this is all that we had about what the Bible teaches about man, what would it teach us about mankind? And so I read verse 27, chapter 1. So God created man in His own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. And one of the things I've said frequently in messages and in lessons is you need to pay attention to things that are repeated, because the author is trying to get at some things. He's trying to make an emphasis. And you'll notice And your Leader's Guide points this out. The word created is used 6 times in this passage. Once at the beginning of the passage, once at the end of the passage, and then in this verse alone, it's used 3 times. It's a word that's only used in association with God. This word is never used in what man does. This word specifically talks about God's creation. Now, the idea of image has a lot of meanings to it. Your Leader's Guide does a good study of that. I'm sure the personal student guide does as well. But it basically has the idea of your first task as a human being is to be like God. And so we talk about those words, created and in the image of God. What is it that the scriptures would teach us just if we had that verse? And that is, we're created by God and that we're created in the image of God. And then I want to make some applications about those 2 words. What does it mean to be created? It means that you have purpose, you have meaning, and because God is our creator. Now, Darwinian evolution says that there's no purpose to life. The 2 main factors of Darwinian evolution is random variations and natural selection. And so if life is nothing more than random variations and natural selection, then there's no purpose. There's no will that's being expressed in creation. And that has an impact on the way we look at life. If God created this world, then his will is evidenced in this world, and we're to be living according to that will. But if God did not create this world, then there is no will, there's no purpose, and you can choose to do whatever it is that you feel is the right thing to do. And that's why we have such social dysfunction in our day that's being supported and practiced in our day. I move to the idea of the image of God. Now, when Moses wrote this would have been stunning to the Israelites, because in the ancient day, the only people who were created in the image of God were the kings and the pharaohs and great royalty. But Moses goes to the extent of saying it's not just kings and pharaohs that are made in the image of God. Every human being is made in the image of God. And that would have been a shocking belief in that day, which meant just as the king was to be respected, just as the king was to be treated with reverence and honor, then it means if we're made in the image of God, every human being, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, regardless of their economic status, regardless of whether they're successful or they're failures, every human being is to be respected and revered because he is made in the image of God. Now we go on to this, we could talk about that, and then we go on to talk about this matter of to be protected. There's a story, by the way, before we move to that I want to tell you that Tim Keller tells in a book entitled Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey. It's a great story to emphasize this idea that creation means there's God's will in store. And where do most people get their understanding of the authority of how to live their life? Tim Keller says this. In 800 AD, there's a Anglo-Saxon warrior. He has 2 strong feelings. One is anger. He feels the need to destroy things and kill people. Well, he's a warrior, and his society says that that's an acceptable thing for him to do, to destroy things and to kill people. A second strong desire he has is same-sex attraction. His society says that is not acceptable for a man to do. So he suppresses those same-sex feelings and doesn't act upon them. But then you come to a Manhattan urbanite. He too has 2 strong feelings. He has feelings for anger. But his society says you can't destroy things and kill people. So he goes to therapy and learns anger management. But his society says it is acceptable to act upon your same-sex feelings. Now, Keller's point is, what is it that's determining how these men choose to live their lives? And he says it's society that they live in. But Christians, we do not base our life on what society says is right or wrong. We are made in the image of God, and that means we're to be godlike. We're to follow and to be godly people. And therefore, we look to God's word to find out how to live. We're created in the image of God. Now, the second part of the lesson is to be protected, and that life is to be protected. Genesis chapter 1, chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. And I read through those verses, and I make various comments about those verses as we read through those. And for example, when it comes to verses 5 through 6, the general principle is in verse 5, and I will require a penalty for your lifeblood. This principle applies to animals. In the next part of that verse, I will require it from any animal or from any human. And then it is applied to people taking a life in the last part, where it says, if someone murders a fellow human, I will require that person's life. Whoever sheds blood by humans, his blood will be shed, for God made humans in his image. The reason for protecting human life, according to this passage, is because, again, this issue of human life. Now, when it came to dealing with that text, I talked about the basis of protecting life is because of the image of God. And then with my class, what really resonated with them is I said, our nursing homes are filled with patients. And we protect those people. We care for them. That's reflection of something we believe about human beings. But suppose we didn't have a Christian view. Suppose we had an economics view. What would happen to the people in the nursing home? Or suppose that we believed that life is supposed to be useful. What would happen to those folks? Or that we believed the greatest value in life was convenience, or not being burdensome, or living a life of dignity. You see, the belief we have about human life has a tremendous impact on how we treat people. The problem with those who define those terms is whatever it is your attitude is towards people affects how you respond to people. And then I pointed out in that particular section, life is to be protected. I asked if anyone had seen this commercial of this winsome little boy sitting in a wheelchair promoting this blanket. I don't know whether it's a Shriners commercial or whether it is a St. Jude's commercial, but this delightful little guy, full of personality, is promoting giving to this organization. Now, there are people that because of their view of life would have said that little boy should not have lived. And look what we would have missed out on. There's a woman in our church I talked to some time back. I was asking about her child who has a physical disability, and I was asking her about that. And this lady whose son is nearly my age, she said, "He is my angel." The whole family has been tremendously blessed by this young man she had a different kind of mindset, a different view of humanity. She could have easily said, "We'll take his life." Life is to be protected. The last part of the lesson is the subject of inaction and in attitude. And it's talking about the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is talking about anger and how a person's anger makes him just as guilty as if he were a murderer. And we were running out of time, as I am on this video, and what I talked about that was the three things: subject to judgment, subject to the court, subject to the hellfire. The main thing Jesus was saying is, if you have these feelings in your heart, this is going to be dealt with by God. You need to deal with this. The way I closed the lesson is I gave everybody a postcard. I asked them to write on top of that postcard that everyone is created in the image of God. Everyone's created in the image of God. And then I told them, would you just pick a day this week and just write down the name of every person you come in contact with. Just write down their name. Maybe you don't know the name, but it's the checker at the grocery store or something of that nature. Every person, they have some kind of encounter. And then at the end of the day, just look over that list and recognize you have encountered someone created by God in the image of God. And just take a moment to reflect on your responses to them. It's a wonderful lesson. I'm excited about you teaching it this Sunday.